Since launching Man vs. Movies back in the summer of 2025, I've largely been, well, civilised. I've covered films that are beloved, respected, or quietly brilliant. Movies that deserve praise. Movies that deserve recognition. Movies where my biggest criticism was something like the third act drag slow. Which, let's be honest, is film nerd for violent disappointment. I've been polite. I've been fair. I've been respectful. That era is over. Because as we kick off a brand new year, I've decided it's time for something different. Something raw. Something unhinged. Something that may cause friendships to fracture, comment sections to ignite, and Vin Diesel to feel a mysterious disturbance in the family force. Yes, today we begin a rant of biblical proportions. I'm talking plagues, I'm talking fire and brimstone, I'm talking a level of cinematic judgment normally reserved for cities that angered God directly. Because today, I am taking on the Fast and the Furious franchise. A series that began as a modest street racing crime film and somehow evolved into a superhero saga where cars are immune to physics, gravity is optional, and the word family is treated like a legally binding spell. Now, I want to be clear, I do not have a drinking problem, but by the end of this rant, I might very well develop one. So buckle up, turn off your logic, pour yourself something very strong. This is Man vs. Movies, and today, man goes to war with the Fast and the Furious. There are movie reviews, and then there are interventions. And what you're about to watch is not a review. It's a cry for help that accidentally learned how to edit a video. Because today we are talking about the Fast and Furious franchise, a series of films that began as What If Point Break but with cars, and somehow evolved into What If the laws of physics were suggestions written by a drunk screenwriter locked in a boot of a Dodge Charger. These movies didn't just jump the shark, they built a launch ramp, filled the shark with explosives, drove over it at 200 miles per hour and shouted "Family!" so loudly that reality itself filed a restraining order. Now, let me be clear before the comments section ignites like a NOS-fueled bonfire. I understand why people like these movies. I get the appeal. Loud cars, big stunts, explosions, bald men staring intensely into sunsets like they're about to drop the most profound sentence you've ever heard, which will inevitably be something like, "We don't turn our backs on family," said with the gravitas of a man revealing the meaning of life despite the fact he's standing next to a barbecue. But here's the problem. Enjoying something does not make it immune from criticism. And these movies have been getting away with absolute nonsense for over 2 decades, purely because they are loud, familiar, and refuse to ever stop. So, today we're doing this properly. Every Fast and Furious movie released so far, all of them. Street racing, vault dragging, submarine fighting, magnet worship, space travel in a car held together with vibes and blind confidence. We are pulling this franchise apart bolt by bolt, insulting the writing, mocking the logic, questioning the sanity, and laughing hysterically at the sheer audacity of it all. This will be long, this will be brutal, I will probably swear on occasion, and if you love these movies, you may feel attacked. If you hate these movies, you may feel seen. And if you're somewhere in the middle, buckle up, because this franchise and I are about to have words. There is something deeply unsettling about the fact that the Fast and Furious franchise did not begin as a jerk. That's the part people forget or deliberately ignore, because admitting it makes everything that follows much more damning. This wasn't born as some knowingly stupid fucking cartoon. It wasn't pitched as a parody, or a comic book, or a superhero saga for men who think engine grease counts as a personality. It started as a real movie. A dumb fucking movie, yes, but a real one. A crime film. A street level story about cops, criminals, loyalty, temptation, and a very specific early 2000s belief that installing neon lights under your car made you a dangerous outlaw rather than a man screaming for attention in a Tesco car park at midnight. And the truly infuriating thing is that the first film almost gets away with it. It's corny, it's ridiculous, the shitty dialogue sounds like it was written by someone who learned human interaction entirely through energy drink commercials, but it understands scale, it understands stakes. People can get hurt, people can fail. Actions have consequences. When something explodes, it's meant to be impressive, not routine. When someone races, it's because they're trying to prove something, not because the universe itself bends to accommodate their ego. Vin Diesel's Dominic Toretto enters the screen like a man who has never had an inside voice. He doesn't speak so much as he declares. Every line is delivered like a proverb, as if he expects it to be quoted on a wall somewhere beneath a picture of a car doing something illegal. He is already absurd, already theatrical, already behaving like a man who believes his own myth. But crucially, the film hasn't yet started treating that myth as literal truth. At this point, Dom is just a guy, a weird guy, a dramatic guy, a guy who would be exhausting to spend more than 10 minutes with, but still, fundamentally, a guy. Paul Walker's Brian O'Connor, meanwhile, is possibly the least convincing undercover cop ever written, portrayed, or conceived by the human imagination. He has the energy of someone who would accidentally introduce himself as Officer Brian Police Cop while wearing a wire the size of a brick. He walks into criminal environments with the subtlety of a foghorn strapped to a golden retriever. He immediately starts bonding with the suspects, emotionally investing in their problems, and forgetting that he is allegedly meant to be dismantling their operation rather than joining their weekly barbecues. And yet, and this is important, it still works. Because the film treats this as a flaw. Brian is conflicted. He's torn between duty and belonging. He's tempted by the life. He makes bad choices, he pays for. This is the last time that will ever happen. Because once the franchise realizes the audiences will show up for cars, noise, and attitude, it quietly begins the process of stripping away anything resembling discipline. The second film doesn't even pretend to care about plausibility. It moves the story to Miami not because it makes narrative sense, but because Miami is colourful and loud and sweaty. And that's what the franchise now believes cinema is. Plot becomes optional. Logic becomes an inconvenience. Undercover work, which in the real world involves discretion, patience, and anonymity, is redefined to mean be the loudest, flashiest, most recognizable person in every room and insist no one notices. Tyrese's Roman Pierce barrels into the series like a man who has never had a thought he didn't immediately shout. He is insecurity given human form. Every line is bravado masking panic. Every insult is a defensive maneuver. And every outburst feels like it's powered by the deep, unshakable fear that someone, somewhere, might not be impressed. And the joke, the real unintentional joke, is that Roman becomes one of the more honest characters in the franchise, because at least he reacts to situations the way a normal person might, with confusion, disbelief, and loud protest at how fucking stupid everything is becoming. This is also where the franchise introduces one of its most enduring lies. The idea that these people are exceptionally skilled rather than simply exceptionally lucky. Races are no longer tests of ability, they're foregone conclusions. The heroes don't adapt, learn, or struggle. They arrive predestined to win. Every setback exists only to make the eventual victory feel louder, not earned. You are not watching characters overcome obstacles, you are watching scripts clear obstacles out of the way so the characters can look cool uninterrupted. Tokyo Drift briefly threatens to reset things by shifting focus, location, and tone. And for a moment, just a moment, you can see an alternate universe where this franchise might have become an anthology of car culture stories. Different cities, different styles, different characters. But that idea collapses almost immediately under the weight of its own nonsense. The protagonist is introduced as a teenager, despite looking like a man who files tax returns early and owns at least one decorative plate. The film insists he can master drifting, an actual skill that takes years to develop, in what feels like a training montage cut down to spare runtime. This is where the franchise commits fully to its most poisonous habit: instant expertise. No effort, no patience, no realism. If the story needs you to be good at something, congratulations, you're now the best in the world at it. Han appears here, effortlessly charismatic, casually cool, and instantly more interesting than everyone else in the room, which only makes what the franchise later does to him even more insulting. Because Han represents something Fast and Furious can't sustain: restraint. He doesn't shout, he doesn't posture, he doesn't need to prove himself, and that kind of energy has no place in a franchise that will soon require every character to behave like they're auditioning to be the loudest man in the apocalypse. By the time the fourth film rolls around, the series decides it wants to be taken seriously. This is where the lighting dims, the colour palette flattens, and characters start growling about justice as if volume alone can substitute for depth. Letty's death is framed as tragic, meaningful, transformative, and then retroactively rendered meaningless. Because the moment this franchise realizes it can undo death, it never stops. Death becomes a suggestion box, a temporary inconvenience, something that only happens until the studio decides it doesn't. This is the point where you, the viewer, should feel the first real flicker of anger. Not because the movie is bad movies are fine, but because it is dishonest. It pretends to ask you to care, while actively dismantling the reasons you might. Why invest emotionally when the rules are made of wet tissue paper? Why mourn when resurrection is only a sequel away? And then Fast 5 happens, and everything breaks. Not slowly, not with subtlety, it snaps. The franchise doesn't escalate. It abandons restraint entirely. The vault chase is thrilling in the same way watching a building collapse is thrilling. Your brain recognizes the spectacle while screaming that something is deeply wrong. That vault would have killed people, lots of people, innocent people. The film treats this like slapstick, like a cartoon anvil falling on faceless extras who don't matter because the camera didn't linger on. This is where the franchise codifies its most grotesque moral rule. If you are not part of the family, you are not real. Fast 5 is the moment the Fast and Furious franchise discovers it can survive anything. Not in the story, but in the real world. It is the exact point where the series realizes that it no longer needs to pretend to obey the rules of cinema, logic or morality, because audiences will show up anyway as long as something big is being dragged, smashed or launched through the air. And once that realization sets in, the franchise never ever looks back. It doesn't just cross a line, it obliterates the concept of lines entirely and replaces them with vibes. Up until this point, the films at least pretended that cars were vehicles. Fast 5 decides that cars are now narrative weapons. The vault chase is where the series commits its first true crime against reality. A steel vault, weighing several tons, is dragged through a populated city at speed, smashing through buildings, street furniture, traffic, and anything unlucky enough to exist in its path. The film presents this as a clever heist and a crowd-pleasing spectacle. What it actually is, when you stop and think for more than half a second, is mass murder played for laughs. Entire lives would have ended in that sequence. People would have been vaporized, families destroyed, insurance companies would have collapsed. The film does not care. The film does not even acknowledge the possibility, because this is where the Fast and the Furious officially decides that anyone not named in the credits is an NPC, and NPCs are disposable. This is also where Dominic Toretto stops being a man and starts becoming a concept. He is no longer a character with flaws or contradictions. He is Dom, capital D, a walking sermon in a tank top. He does not react, he affirms. He does not struggle, he believes. The films stop asking whether he can succeed and start asking how loudly the universe can bend to accommodate him. Every decision he makes is treated as morally correct by default, because he made it. If Dom decides something is right, the film rewrites reality until it agrees. This is not character writing, this is religious iconography. And the franchise rewards itself for this behaviour. Fast 5 is a hit, a big one, a we can do whatever we want now hit. And so the lesson is learned. Bigger is better. Consequences are for cowards. And physics is merely a suggestion written by people who don't understand the importance of family. Fast and Furious 6 doesn't just double down on this. It straps a tank to it and drives directly over the corpse of plausibility. By now, the franchise is openly hostile to the idea that anything should make sense. The villains are evil versions of the family, because originality has been quietly euthanized. Letty returns from the dead, not with a meaningful exploration of trauma or identity, but with amnesia, the laziest possible narrative tool. deployed with all the care of a brick through a window. Memory becomes another thing the franchise treats as optional. Characters remember what the plot needs them to remember, and forget what might complicate the next action sequence. And then there is the runway. That runway deserves special attention because it is one of the most egregious insults ever committed to film. That runway is not merely long, it is cosmically long. It exists outside geography, outside time, outside reason. Planes accelerate, cars crash, recover, crash again. Characters run, fight, leap, and still, they have not reached the end. That runway is not infrastructure, it is a pocket dimension. It is the cinematic equivalent of a dream where you're trying to run but never get anywhere. And the film expects you to accept it, not question it, not laugh at it, accept it. This is the moment the franchise looks you in the eye and dares you to care about reality. If you don't say, "What the actual fuck" here, you are a stronger person than most. By Furious 7, the franchise has fully embraced its new identity as a superhero saga that refuses to admit it is one. Cars are no longer bound by momentum or gravity. They fall from planes, they jump between skyscrapers like it's nothing. The series is no longer asking, how would this work? It is asking, wouldn't this look cool? And stopping there. And to be clear, sometimes it does look cool. But cool is not the same as coherent. And the franchise has long since stopped pretending it cares about the difference. Jason Statham's arrival as Deckard Shaw brings a jolt of energy, but even here, the writing is on autopilot. He is invincible because the plot says so. He survives explosions, falls, impacts that would reduce a normal human being to paste, because once invulnerability is introduced, it spreads. Everyone is now functionally immortal, unless the script needs a brief emotional beat, and even then, it will probably be undone later. The farewell to Paul Walker is sincere, and it works precisely because it is one of the few moments the franchise allows itself to be quiet. No engines, no explosions, just absence. And that should have been the moment the series reflected, recalibrated, maybe even concluded. Instead, it uses that emotional goodwill as fuel to become even louder, even more fucking ridiculous, even more convinced of its own importance. The Fate of the Furious is where the franchise officially forgets what genre it is. It flirts with espionage, cyber terrorism, and global annihilation, all while insisting it is still, somehow, a car movie. Cypher is not a character. She is a collection of hacker buzzwords wearing a leather jacket. She can do anything. She can control anything. Why? Because the plot needs her to. Technology in this universe is not a tool. It is magic. There are no rules, no limitations, no systems. Computers simply do what the story requires, and the characters nod solemnly as if any of this makes sense. Dom betrays the family, which is presented as shocking despite being transparently temporary. There is no tension because there is no doubt. The franchise has trained its audience to expect reversals, retcons, and redemptions. Nothing sticks. Nothing scars. Nothing lasts. And then As if to prove it has entirely lost perspective, the film introduces a nuclear submarine into a car chase. This is not escalation. This is parody without self-awareness. This is the cinematic equivalent of a child smashing action figures together and insisting it's art. Hobbs Shaw spins off into something closer to honesty. It knows it's absurd. It leans into the ego, the banter, the spectacle. The Rock and Jason Statham spend most of the runtime trying to out-macho each other, and while it's still utter nonsense, it's nonsense with intent. Idris Elba plays a villain who might as well be from a comic book, and for once, the film doesn't pretend otherwise. It is Fast and Furious stripped of its fake gravitas and presented as what it actually is. Professional wrestling with guns and cars. It's loud, it's dumb, it's exhausting, but at least it's not lying to you about it. Then F9 happens, and the last fragments of restraint are atomized. The secret brother reveal is perhaps the most perfect encapsulation of the franchise's creative bankruptcy. Dom has a brother. Of course he does. Everyone has a secret sibling in this universe. It's like trauma-induced mitosis. Characters reproduce narratively whenever the plot needs artificial depth. This brother has been lurking just off screen for decades apparently, never mentioned, never acknowledged, waiting patiently for the moment the franchise ran out of ideas. And when he arrives, he is not explored as a character so much as deployed as a plot device. Family is no longer a theme, it is a blunt instrument. Han returns from the dead, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but literally. And this is the moment death dies. Completely. Utterly. Permanently. There are no stakes anymore. There is no loss. Anyone can come back at any time for any reason. And the franchise does not even pretend to justify it beyond vague hand waving. If you are still emotionally invested at this point, that's on you. The films have made it clear they are not going to respect that investment. And then they go to space. Not figuratively, not in a dream, not as a joke. They go to space in a car. A car wrapped in improvised technology and blind confidence. This is not a shark jumping moment. The shark was left behind several sequels ago, sobbing. This is the franchise launching itself directly into orbit and expecting applause for the audacity alone. Magnets are introduced and immediately abused like a toddler discovering the word why. Magnets do everything. Magnets solve everything. Magnets are now God. By the time Fast X arrives, the franchise is exhausted, but refuses to admit it. It dresses itself up as an epic mythology, dragging in references, callbacks, and legacy elements like a Gracie's Hits album nobody asked for. Jason Momoa is the lone bright spot, because he understands that the only way to play this material is to lean into its absurdity. He chews scenery with glee, dancing through the wreckage like a man who knows the joke and is enjoying it. Everyone else is trapped in the weight of law so dense it collapses in on itself. And then the film doesn't end. It just stops. It halts mid-thought, mid-motion, mid-explosion, as if the franchise itself ran out of breath. This is not a cliffhanger. This is a stall. This is the cinematic equivalent of saying, wait, don't leave yet. We can still sell you another one. And that's where we leave it. For now. Because from here, the franchise doesn't just continue, it metastasizes. By the time you reach the later Fast and Furious films, something profoundly strange has happened. Not just to the franchise, but to the audience's relationship with it. We're no longer watching movies in the traditional sense. We're participating in a ritual of expectation management. The films no longer need to surprise, challenge, or even meaningfully entertain. They simply need to arrive, and audiences will do the rest of the work themselves. This is the point where the franchise stops telling stories and starts coasting on familiarity. Like a band that hasn't written a new song in 15 years, but still tours on the strength of a chorus everyone knows by heart. And that chorus is one word. One endlessly repeated, aggressively overused, narratively weaponized word. Family. Family in Fast and Furious is not a theme. It's not an idea. It's not even a value. It's a get out of writing free card. Whenever the story collapses under the weight of its own nonsense, family. Whenever a character survives something that should have turned them into a red mist, family. Whenever logic, motivation, or common sense threaten to intrude, family. It's a magic incantation that instantly absolves the script of responsibility. Characters don't need arcs, they don't need growth, they just need to believe harder. And belief in this universe is stronger than gravity. This is why Dominic Toretto eventually stops resembling a human being altogether. He doesn't change, he doesn't learn, he doesn't doubt, he doesn't meaningfully react to anything. He is a fixed point around which the universe rearranges itself. If Dom says something is possible, it becomes possible. If Dom believes someone can be redeemed, they are redeemed. If Dom needs to jump a car across an impossible gap, the laws of physics politely step aside and let him through. He is no longer a protagonist. He is a cosmic constant. And the films treat this as aspirational. What's especially maddening is that the franchise insists on framing this stagnation as death. Dom is stoic, therefore he is wise. Dom is quiet, therefore he is profound. Dom never changes his mind, therefore he is strong. But what the films mistake for strength is actually creative paralysis. A character who cannot change is not iconic. He's inert. He's a mannequin in a vest endlessly repeating the same emotional beat while the world explodes around him. And that emotional beat is always the same. Someone threatens the family. Dom growls, engines rev, something explodes. Repeat. This repetition infects every other character too. Roman stops being funny and becomes comic relief by default. A man whose only function is to say what the audience might be thinking before the film ignores it anyway. Tej, once a mechanic with some grounding in reality, evolves into a techno wizard who can invent world-changing devices between explosions. Ramsey exists primarily to say, I can do that, whenever the plot needs an impossible hack performed instantly. These people are no longer characters, they are functions. And because they are functions, they cannot fail. Failure is the one thing Fast and Furious refuses to allow. Setbacks are temporary. Losses are cosmetic. Death is a light inconvenience. Every obstacle exists only to be overcome, and usually within the same scene. There is no lingering cost, no scars, no trauma that isn't immediately smoothed over by another group hug and a barbecue. The franchise wants the emotional payoff of danger without any of the discomfort of consequence. It wants tension without risk, victory without sacrifice. This is why the action starts to feel hollow, no matter how big it gets. Explosions stop being impressive when you know no one important will be harmed. Car crashes stop being thrilling when you know the driver will crawl out without a scratch, crack a jerk, and continue as if nothing happened. Even the villains lose their teeth because you know, without question, that if they survive long enough, they'll probably be invited to join the family themselves. Redemption is not earned in this franchise, it is scheduled. This is particularly obvious in the way antagonists are treated. They arrive as terrifying threats capable of anything, only to be defanged the moment the plot requires it. They are dangerous until they aren't, skilled until they suddenly make idiotic mistakes, motivated until the script forgets why they were angry in the first place. And if the actor is popular enough, or the audience responds well enough, congratulations, you're not a villain anymore, you're just misunderstood. Welcome to the barbecue. And let's talk about that barbecue, because it is the single most overused visual metaphor in modern cinema. That table is not heartwarming, it's not earned, it's not cathartic, it's a contractual obligation. Every time the camera circles that table, the film is begging you to feel something it hasn't actually earned. It's emotional shorthand masquerading as payoff. The cinematic equivalent of ending an argument by saying, "We're all friends here," and hoping nobody remembers what they were arguing about. The franchise's technical choices only exacerbate this emptiness. The editing becomes increasingly frantic, as if the films are terrified that if a shot lasts longer than half a second, the audience might start asking questions. Action scenes are no longer constructed, they are assaulted into existence. Cuts pile on cuts, geography dissolves, you are not watching events unfold, you are watching noise arranged into the vague shape of motion. This is not kinetic filmmaking, it's visual panic. The music follows suit. Gone are distinctive themes or memorable motifs. In their place is an endless churn of bass drops, percussion hits, and epic cues designed to tell you how to feel, instead of letting the images do the work. It's sonic bullying. The soundtrack does not accompany the action. It shoves your head toward it and demands enthusiasm. And underneath all of this is a profound insecurity. For all its bluster, the Fast and Furious franchise is terrified of slowing down, terrified of quiet, terrified of stillness, terrified that if it ever stops moving, even briefly, the illusion will collapse. That's why every film has to be bigger than the last, louder, more absurd, more detached from reality, because escalation is the only tool left once storytelling has been abandoned. This is why space happens. Space is not a creative decision, it is a surrender. It is the moment the franchise admits that there is nowhere left to go on Earth that hasn't already been blown up, jumped over, or driven through sideways. Space is escalation for escalation's sake. It is spectacle as desperation. And the film treats it not as a joke, not as parody, but as triumph. Look how far we've come, it says. Look how bold we are. Look how fearless. What it never does is ask whether it should have stopped. Fast X exposes this exhaustion more clearly than any previous entry. It is bloated, self-referential, and strangled by its own mythology. It spends more time reminding you of past glories than creating new ones. It is a franchise trapped in a loop, devouring its own history to sustain itself. And when it can't find a way forward, it simply pauses. Not with intention, not with confidence, but with the unmistakable energy of a machine that has been pushed beyond its design limits and is now rattling ominously. The tragedy, and yes there is one, is that none of this was inevitable. The Fast and Furious franchise could have evolved in interesting ways. It could have embraced anthology storytelling. It could have leaned into grounded crime again. It could have ended gracefully. Instead, it chose to become a parody of itself while it was insisting it was still sincere. That's the unforgivable part. Not that it's dumb, not that it's loud, not that it's ridiculous, but that it demands to be taken seriously while doing absolutely nothing to earn that respect. It wants applause for excess, praise for audacity, loyalty for familiarity. It wants you to confuse repetition with tradition, noise with passion, and inertia with strength. And the longer it goes on, the more obvious the manipulation becomes. This franchise doesn't trust its audience. It distracts them. It overwhelms them. It buries doubt under explosions and expects gratitude in return. It is the cinematic equivalent of someone shouting over you until you stop arguing and just nod. And yet, somehow, it keeps working. Which might be the most depressing jerk of all. Because Fast and Furious is not just a franchise anymore. It's a case study in how far spectacle can carry something after substance has left the building. It is proof that if you say family enough times, you don't actually have to mean it. You just have to say it louder. At some point during the Fast and Furious saga, a strange defensive reflex developed around it. And that reflex has become just as exhausting as the films themselves. You'll hear it every time someone dares to criticize these movies beyond a surface level jerk. You're taking it too seriously. They're just dumb fun. They know what they are. You're not supposed to think about it. And this is where the franchise's most insidious trick reveals itself. Because that defense is not clever. It's a surrender disguised as wisdom. It is the cinematic equivalent of shrugging and saying whatever while handing over your wallet. The idea that a film being dumb on purpose somehow exempts it from criticism is one of the laziest intellectual maneuvers in modern pop culture. Intent does not negate execution. Self-awareness does not equal quality. And choosing to be stupid is not the same as being good at being stupid. The Fast and Furious films don't transcend criticism by acknowledging their absurdity. They weaponize that acknowledgement as a shield. They dare you to complain, then mock you for doing exactly that. It's gaslighting blockbuster style. Of course it doesn't make sense, the films seem to say. That's the point. Why are you so mad? And the answer is simple. Because you still want applause for it. If these movies truly didn't care about logic, coherence, or emotional investment, they wouldn't keep desperately trying to manufacture gravitas. They wouldn't linger on slow motion hugs. They wouldn't drown moments in swelling music and solemn looks. They wouldn't frame Dom like a messianic figure standing against sunsets as if he's about to deliver the Sermon on the Mount, but with cars. You don't get to have it both ways. You don't get to scream, "Don't take this seriously," while demanding emotional buying. You don't get to mock realism and still ask the audience to feel moved by deaths you already taught them not to trust. And the fanbase, or at least the loudest, most defensive segment of it, plays directly into this contradiction. There's a cultish energy to the way criticism is dismissed, as if pointing out flaws is some kind of moral failing, as if acknowledging that the Emperor has no clothes is a personal attack on anyone who enjoys the parade. Liking something does not make it immune to analysis. Enjoyment is not evidence of quality, and pretending otherwise doesn't make you chill or enlightened. It just means you've decided comfort is more important than honesty. What's especially galling is how often irony is used as a blanket defense. It's meant to be ridiculous. Fine, then why does it keep pretending it's epic? Why does it keep inflating its own mythology like it's telling the story of modern gods rather than a group of people who solve geopolitical crises with a wrench and a prayer? True camp knows it's camp. True parody commits to the bit. Fast and Furious exists in a cowardly middle ground where it wants credit for being self-aware without fully embracing the consequences of that awareness. It winks just enough to dodge responsibility, then turns deadly serious the moment it wants applause. This is why the franchise's humour rarely lands. The jokes are either broad and obvious or undercut by the film immediately snapping back into faux earnest mode. Roman says something self-aware, the audience laughs, and then the movie carries on exactly as before, unchanged, unchallenged. Nothing is learned, nothing is adjusted. The self-awareness is decorative. It's not commentary, it's camouflage. And that camouflage allows the franchise to avoid the most uncomfortable question of all. Why is this still going? Not how much money does it make, but why? What is left to say? What emotional ground remains unexplored? What thematic depth is still untapped? The answer increasingly is nothing. There is no creative necessity driving these films forward. There is only momentum, inertia, the fear of stopping, the terror that if the engine cuts out, everyone might finally notice there's no destination. This is where Fast and Furious becomes a perfect metaphor for blockbuster decay. It represents an industry terrified of risk, terrified of silence, terrified of endings. Everything must continue. Everything must expand. Every story must become a universe. Every character must be franchised. And if that means inflating something well past its natural lifespan until it collapses under its own weight, so be it. Better to keep extracting value than to let something rest. The irony is that the franchise constantly talks about loyalty, family, and togetherness, while embodying the most cynical form of corporate storytelling imaginable. These films are not made because someone has something to say. They are made because they can be. Because the brand still sells. Because familiarity is safer than creativity. And the longer this goes on, the more aggressively the films insist that this hollow repetition is actually virtue, tradition, legacy, as if refusing to evolve is somehow noble. There's a particular sadness to watching characters you may have once enjoyed become prisoners of their own mythology. Roman reduced to a punchline machine, Tej reduced to techno-babble delivery, Dom reduced to a walking slogan. Even the villains suffer this fate, cycling through exaggerated quirks and half-baked motivations that exist solely to be overcome, neutralized, or absorbed into the ever-expanding family blob. Everyone is flattened. Everyone is simplified. Complexity is sanded down until nothing sharp remains. And yet the films keep posturing as if they're profound. As if they're about something more than escalation. As if shouting family is the same as exploring what family actually means. There is no tension between loyalty and morality. No cost to unconditional allegiance. No examination of what happens when family is wrong. The concept is never interrogated, only celebrated, endlessly, unquestioningly. Family is always right. Family is always justified. Family is always rewarded. It's moral absolutism disguised as warmth, and it's intellectually bankrupt. By this point, the Fast and Furious franchise isn't just creatively empty. It's creatively afraid. Afraid to end. Afraid to change. Afraid to let go of the safety net it's built out of nostalgia, repetition, and noise. Every sequel feels less like a story and more like a reassurance. Don't worry, this is still the thing you recognize. Don't worry, nothing will really change. Don't worry, no matter how ridiculous it gets, we'll still play the same emotional notes and expect the same reaction. And maybe that's why it provokes such anger. Not because it's stupid, but because it refuses to grow. Because it mistakes stagnation for identity. Because it confuses loyalty with obedience. Because it demands love without ever risking vulnerability. Fast and Furious wants diversion without accountability. It wants passion without scrutiny. It wants praise without effort. And it has trained a generation of viewers to defend that bargain as if it were enlightenment rather than apathy. That's not harmless. That's not just dumb fun. That's a creative dead end dressed up as confidence. One of the most cynical lies the Fast and Furious franchise ever told, and the one it still gets credit for, is the idea that it represents grit, authenticity, and some kind of working class street level soul. This is the myth it clings to like a security blanket. The fantasy that these are movies about real people from real places doing things their own way. That Dom Toretto is some kind of blue-collar warrior poet. That these films are still, in any meaningful sense, about the streets. And nothing exposes the intellectual dishonesty of this franchise more than how aggressively it clings to that identity while becoming one of the most sanitized, corporate, focus group products modern cinema has ever vomited into existence. The early films flirted with a version of this. They weren't accurate, not even close, but they gestured towards something tactile. Street racing as an outlaw hobby, garages as social hubs, crime as something grubby and small, not world-ending. You could almost believe these people lived somewhere when the cameras weren't rolling. But as the franchise ballooned, that authenticity didn't evolve. It evaporated. What replaced it was cosplay. A hollow aesthetic of grease and grit with none of the risk, consequence, or discomfort that actually comes with those worlds. Dom is supposedly a man of the people, yet he now operates on a scale that makes billionaires look underfunded. He doesn't struggle, he doesn't scrape by, he doesn't even appear to exist within an economy. Money is infinite, resources are unlimited. Every problem can be solved with access to military-grade hardware and global logistics networks that would make most governments blush. This is not working-class fantasy. It's plutocratic delusion dressed up in a sleeveless shirt. The franchise wants you to believe these characters are outsiders while giving them more power, immunity, and narrative privilege than almost any superheroes in cinema. They are above the law, above consequence, above morality, and eventually above the planet itself. And yet the films keep insisting they're just regular people who value family and loyalty. It's a staggering contradiction. You cannot simultaneously be an untouchable global force of destruction and a humble street racer from the neighbourhood. One of those things has to give. Fast and Furious refuses to choose, because choosing would require self-awareness. And that's where the corporate rot becomes impossible to ignore. These films are not rebellious, they are not dangerous, they are not transgressive. They are among the safest possible products a studio can make. Every rough edge has been sanded down, every moral ambiguity removed. Violence has no cost, death has no permanence, crime has no victims. The outlaw fantasy is preserved in name only, while everything that might actually challenge the audience is carefully exercised. This is rebellion without risk, edge without sharpness, anarchy curated by committee. The irony is painful. The franchise constantly frames itself as anti-authority while functioning as one of the most obedient servants of blockbuster formula imaginable. It follows beats, it follows trends, it expands into spin-offs and cinematic universes like it's ticking boxes on a corporate roadmap. It celebrates family while behaving like a brand first and a story last. And it expects to be applauded for this, as if refusing to change is a virtue rather than a failure of imagination. This is why the emotional manipulation becomes so naked in the later films. Slow motion group shots, lingering stares, overwrought speeches about loyalty delivered as if they contain wisdom rather than repetition. The franchise has confused familiarity with meaning. It thinks repeating the same emotional beats automatically deepens them. It doesn't. It flattens them. It turns what could have been genuine into a slogan. And slogans are all this franchise has left. Every time Dom talks about family, it's not insight, it's branding. Every barbecue scene is not warmth, it's reassurance. Every callback is not nostalgia, it's bait. The films are no longer interested in telling you a story. They are interested in reminding you that you've seen previous ones and hoping that recognition triggers affection. It's emotional conditioning, not storytelling. The most damning thing is how completely this franchise misunderstands its own appeal. People didn't fall in love with Fast and Furious because it was big. They fell in love because it was specific, because it had a texture, a vibe, a sense of place. As that specificity disappeared, the franchise mistook scale for evolution. Louder instead of deeper, bigger instead of better. It kept inflating without adding substance, like a balloon filled with hot air and marketing slogans. And now, it's trapped. It can't go back to street racing. That would feel small. It can't escalate much further without becoming outright parody. And it's already dangerously close to that. It can't kill characters, no one would believe it. It can't end, because endings require conviction. So, it does the only thing it knows how to do. Keep moving, keep exploding, keep insisting that this time, this chapter, this sequel matters. But it doesn't. And deep down, the film knows it. That's why they shout. That's why they run. That's why they drown every quiet moment in music and noise. Silence would expose the emptiness. Stillness would invite thought. And thought is the enemy of a franchise built on momentum alone. Fast and Furious didn't just lose its soul. It traded it in willingly, piece by piece, for box office returns and cultural inertia. And what's left is not offensive because it's done, but because it's hollow. Because it pretends to stand for something while standing for nothing at all. And that's the real tragedy. Not that the movies are fucking ridiculous, but they could have been much more, and chose not to be. At a certain point, it becomes impossible to avoid the simplest, ugliest truth about the Fast and Furious saga. It should have ended years ago. Not paused, not taken in a bold new direction, ended. Properly, cleanly, with intention, with dignity. Instead, it chose the most cowardly option available to modern blockbuster cinema. Perpetual continuation. The refusal to stop. The refusal to commit. The refusal to accept that stories, like engines, eventually wear out no matter how hard you rev them. This franchise did not run out of road accidentally. It ignored every exit sign on purpose. What we are watching now isn't a story unfolding. It's a machine refusing to shut down. Characters no longer exist to explore ideas or relationships, they exist to be wheeled out on cue like mascots. Plot is no longer a progression, it's a holding pattern. Stakes are no longer meaningful, they're decorative. Every sequel promises finality, reckoning, legacy, and then immediately hedges its bets, splits itself into parts, teases future chapters, and backs away from resolution like it's afraid someone might notice the ride is over. And the most insulting part is that it still pretends this is passion. There's a smugness to the way these movies carry on, a self-satisfied confidence that volume equals value and endurance equals importance. Look how long we've lasted, they seem to say, as if survival alone were proof of artistic worth, as if longevity were the same thing as relevance, as if being unable to let go were a virtue instead of a symptom. Because the truth is, Fast and Furious doesn't endure because it has something to say. It endures because it has trained its audience not to expect anything new. It has lowered the bar so consistently, so successfully, that repetition feels comforting rather than disappointing. You know exactly what you're going to get, and the franchise relies on that familiarity like a crutch, not to challenge you, not to surprise you, just to reassure you that nothing will change, no matter how absurd it becomes. That's why the ending of each film feels increasingly hollow. The hugs don't land, the speeches ring false, the triumphs feel unearned. You've seen it all before, just louder and dumber. The emotional beats are recycled so often they've lost all resonance. They're not moments, they're obligations, boxes to tick before the next explosion. And this is where the franchise crosses from being merely silly into being actively corrosive. Because what Fast and Furious ultimately teaches, intentionally or not, is that growth is unnecessary, reflection is weakness, and escalation is the only acceptable response to fatigue. It teaches that problems don't require understanding, only force. That loyalty excuses everything. That questioning the group is betrayal. That consequences are for other people. It's moral simplicity masquerading as strength. And it's sold with such confidence that it dares you to object. The films don't want an audience. They want assent. They want you to cheer because cheering is expected. They want you to laugh because the joke is familiar. They want you to cry because the music swells, not because anything meaningful has occurred. They want emotional compliance, not engagement. And if you resist, if you point out the absurdity, the laziness, the emptiness, you're told you're missing the point, that you're thinking too much, that you should just turn your brain off. But turning your brain off isn't freedom, it's surrender. What's worse is that the franchise confuses endurance with legacy. It wants to be remembered not for what it achieved, but for how long it kept going. It wants to be mythic without earning myth, epic without consequence, legendary without risk. And that's why it keeps inflating itself with callbacks, cameos, and remember this moments, because it knows, deep down, that nostalgia is easier than creation. And yeah, there was a moment, several moments actually, where it could have stopped, where it could have closed the book and walked away with goodwill intact. Furious 7 could have been an ending. Fast 5 could have been an ending. Even earlier than that, the franchise could have reinvented itself honestly instead of inflating itself artificially. It chose none of those paths. It chose continuation at all costs. And that choice defines everything that followed. By the time you reach the most recent entries, the films feel less like movies and more like contractual obligations being fulfilled with pyrotechnics. They are bloated, exhausted, and desperate to convince you they're still vital. They shout because they're afraid of silence, they run because they're afraid of stopping, they split themselves into parts because finality terrifies them. And the saddest part is that none of this makes them funnier or more thrilling in the long run. It makes them tedious, predictable, hollow. The audacity that once felt shocking now feels routine. The spectacle that once felt outrageous now feels compulsory. Even the fucking stupidity has lost its spark, because stupidity without creativity is just noise. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a franchise that wants to be loved uncritically, remembered unconditionally, and continued indefinitely, without ever having to justify its existence again. It leaves us with movies that confuse loyalty with depth, repetition with tradition, and noise with meaning. It leaves us with a brand that mistakes refusal to end for resilience. And if that doesn't make you angry, not just amused, but genuinely irritated, then congratulations. The franchise has done its job. It has trained you well. Because the real legacy of Fast and Furious isn't the cars, the stunts, or even the memes. It's the normalization of creative stagnation. The idea that as long as something sells, it doesn't need to grow. That as long as something is loud, it doesn't need to be thoughtful. That as long as something repeats the right words, family, loyalty, legacy, it doesn't need to earn. That's why this series deserved to be torn apart, not gently ribbed, not excused, not shrugged off, because it represents a mindset that has infected blockbuster cinema at every level. Don't stop, don't change, don't reflect, just keep going, no matter how empty it becomes. And that's the final insult. Fast and Furious didn't burn out. It didn't crash. It didn't even fail spectacularly. It just refused to grow up. For fuck's sake, enough! Enough pretending this is bold. Enough pretending this is deep. Enough pretending repetition is loyalty and noise is heart. Because unlike this franchise, you're allowed to end things. And that's the difference. So, there you go. That is the Fast and Furious franchise. A cinematic journey that started with DVD player theft and ended with men solving international crisis by shouting about family and launching cars into orbit. A series that confused escalation with evolution, noise with meaning, and repetition with loyalty. A franchise that didn't just refuse to grow up, it actively mocked the idea of maturity, then drove away from it sideways while something exploded behind it in slow motion. If you love these movies, genuinely, I'm happy for you. Comfort food exists. Sometimes you want something big, dumb, and familiar. But let's not pretend this is high art or carefully planned storytelling, or some profound mythological saga. It's professional wrestling with cars. It's soap opera logic wrapped in $1 billion explosion. And that's fine, as long as we're honest about it. Now I want to hear from you. Which Fast movie finally broke you? Which one made you sit there, staring at the screen, wondering when exactly the franchise lost its mind? And, be honest, which one do you secretly enjoy despite knowing full well it's absolute fucking nonsense? Drop it in the comments, because reading those arguments is almost as entertaining as watching these movies ignore gravity. And if you enjoyed this unhinged cinematic breakdown, or if you just appreciate someone else losing their sanity so you don't have to, do me a favour and like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Genuinely helps Man vs Movies grow, and unlike the Fast and Furious franchise, I promise I'm not going to split this rant into 3 unnecessary parts and call it a saga. Until next time, this is Man vs Movies wishing you a happy new year. Until next time, this is Man vs Movies hoping you have a happy new year and best wishes for 2026.